Hi, everybody. This is Jennifer Hurst-Wender. I'm Director of Museum Operations for Preservation Virginia. And I am broadcasting this webinar from my dining room. And so I do have to warn everybody that I do have a couple of dogs. And so they're upstairs, but they may bark, and I apologize for that beforehand. I also have some chickens in the kitchen. They're babies. They're about 5 weeks old. And so if you hear chirping, that's them. It's the evening here at the house, so there may be an occasion where you hear footsteps somewhere in the house as well. So we'll make do with what we have. But today we're going to be talking about John Marshall, and we're going to be talking about some of the people and places that he lived at, experienced, came into contact with, and there's a lot of really interesting stories. But the way that this is going to work is that we have a pre-recorded webinar. It's 23 minutes, and it's going to be me talking also from my dining room. And there's going to be a whole bunch of images that have been spliced in there. And so the images, a lot of them are maps, a lot of them are drawings or photos of places that are associated with John Marshall. And then after the 23-minute webinar is over, I'm going to have a Q&A. I will say that I looked at the list of people who are attending, and I know that there's some of you out there who are John Marshall aficionados. So just so you know, if we're going into this Q&A and there's a question that I don't know the answer to, I may call you out. So be listening. With that, we'll go ahead and I'm going to start, and I'll see you live in about 23 minutes. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about John Marshall's life at home for this webinar. My name is Jennifer Hurst-Wender, and I'm pleased to be Preservation Virginia's Director of Museum Operations. The home John Marshall had built for his family in Richmond in 1790, and where he lived until his death in 1835, was acquired by the city of Richmond in 1909 with the intent to tear it down and build John Marshall's High School in its place. Thanks to a very vocal public outcry, the house was saved from demolition and managed by Preservation Virginia, which at the time was called the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, or APVA. It opened to the public in 1911 as a historic house, and since that time, the high school has been torn down, and in its place stands the John Marshall Courts building. In 2005, on John Marshall's 250th birthday, the city of Richmond gave Preservation Virginia the deed to this historic landmark. Preservation Virginia celebrated its 135th anniversary in February of this year. We are the oldest statewide historic preservation organization in the country, and in that time, we have continued to work to ensure the relevancy of the Commonwealth's historic places. We own and operate the John Marshall House, Patrick Henry's home, Scotchtown, Bacon's Castle and Smith's Fort Plantation, Cape Henry Lighthouse, and historic Jamestown. Our statewide preservation initiatives have led us to preserve John Marshall's birthplace, the Hollow, advocate on behalf of the Randolph Masonic Lodge, where he was the Grand Master, and assist with the preservation of the church that he helped construct, Monumental Church. The multifaceted and impactful nature of our advocacy programs, our 6 historic sites, and partnerships with other organizations has allowed us to create a holistic approach to saving the places that connect us all to our diverse and complex history. I hope that if you're not already a member, that this program, our preservation initiatives, and our many other programs at our historic sites will inspire you to become a part of Preservation Virginia. At the John Marshall House, we're fortunate enough to be surrounded by an enormous collection of Marshall objects, including the house that he had built. Almost 50% of everything in his house belonged to him and his family. Because of this, we have a pretty good idea of his personal taste, strong, simple, stylish, and often local. It'd be a good idea for me to go back and build up how and why Marshall's home was constructed in the most fashionable neighborhood of the new capital of the Commonwealth. On September 23, 1755, John Marshall was born to Thomas Marshall and his wife Mary Randolph Keith Marshall at a small cabin in what would become Fauquier County. He would be the first of 15 children born to the couple, all of which survived into adulthood. The Marshalls would move their family into the Hollow with 2 rooms on the first floor and 2 in the loft above, on the banks of Goose Creek in Leeds Manor, which was part of Lord Fairfax's land. At the Hollow, John would grow as a frontiersman, educated by his parents, transcribing Alexander Pope, and reading the classics from his father's library, as well as from some believe the library of Lord Fairfax. He studied at school for a year alongside James Monroe at the academy run by the Reverend Archibald Campbell, and then another year with a tutor, Reverend James Thompson, who was sent from Edinburgh and who lived with the Marshall family. In 1773, Thomas Marshall had Oak Hill constructed on his own 1,700-acre estate, 10 miles from the Hollow. Now, this home was yet another 1.5-story cottage, but it was double the size of their previous home, with 4 rooms on the first floor and 3 above. It was from Oak Hill that Thomas Marshall and his oldest son John would join the Culpeper Minutemen. They would fight in the Battle of Great Bridge in buckskins embroidered with Patrick Henry's "Liberty or Death" in white letters. Marshall's time as a soldier would continue as he fought for General Washington at Brandywine under General Morgan's elite rifle regiment, the Virginia 11th. This unit was composed of frontier sharpshooters. Marshall spent a harsh winter in Valley Forge, and it is said that this harrowing experience profoundly affected him in his political beliefs. Eventually, he would become one of the young nation's leading Federalists. But as a young rifleman, his fellow soldiers remarked that he was the most cheerful and optimistic man they knew, never complained, and was an inexhaustible font of anecdotes. By the end of 1779, Marshall had been furloughed from the army and trekked down to visit his father, who was commanding the state's artillery regiment in Yorktown. In anticipation of John's arrival, a ball was thrown in his honor by the Ambler family of Yorktown. Thomas had been reading letters from his son John to Jacqueline Ambler, his wife Rebecca Burwell, and their 4 daughters. Anticipation to meet the accomplished soldier was high, but instead of the dashing war hero that was expected, John was lanky, awkward, and unpolished. Just shy of 14, Mary, known as Polly Ambler, was not taken aback by this backwoods captain like her sisters appear to have been. She was smitten with a 25-year-old war hero. For the next 6 weeks, he stayed in Yorktown, and he took up every opportunity to spend time with the Ambler family, reading them poetry and introducing them to authors they had not yet heard. In May of 1780, Marshall enrolled at William and Mary and began studying under Chancellor George Wythe. His fellow classmates included Bushrod Washington and Spencer Roane. It's worth noting that Wythe notoriously scheduled the most difficult work early in the day. Marshall excelled as an early riser, and throughout the rest of his life, he would most often wake before sunrise for a brisk walk to begin his day, and return for breakfast before others were even awake. By August 28th of 1780, he had taken his oath and was formally admitted to the bar in Fauquier County. Now, growing restless without a client base due to the war, he walked to Philadelphia to rejoin the army, as was his typical method of travel. He traveled 30 to 35 miles per day. During this voyage, we get an insight into one of the many times that Marshall is misidentified. So the first hotel that he found after 2 weeks of travel actually turned him away because of his shabby clothing and unkempt hair and long beard. Resigning his commission in February 1781, he returned to Richmond, where the Ambler family had moved to the new capital of Virginia, after Jacqueline Ambler had been made treasurer of the Commonwealth. John took up courting Polly, engaging in politics, and running for his seat in the Virginia legislature. The story of John's proposal to Polly is legendary. When he asks Polly to marry him, Polly refuses. So John says goodbye to Polly, he mounts his horse, and he heads for Oak Hill. Weeping inconsolably, Polly cuts a lock of her hair off and she gives it to her cousin, John, who rides after her suitor. So catching up to him, he hands over the lock of hair. Marshall turns around, rides back, and asks Polly again, and this time she says yes. So Marshall has this particular lock of hair placed into a gold locket as a wedding present for his bride. And she wears the locket until on her deathbed, where she removes it and she gives it to her husband. And he wears it. And in his will, it's stated that this locket is to be the last thing removed from his body after death. It's said that the locket represents a poem, and the lock of hair represents a poem that we are pretty sure both of them are very familiar with, The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. Their wedding was held in the cottage in Hanover on January 3rd, 1783. So the couple sets up their first rented home in the capital of Richmond. Now, this is before Jefferson's capital was constructed in 1788. And the town's population is around 1,200 people. There were approximately 200 dwellings. Almost all of them were wooden, and the streets were dirt and mud. And the General Assembly was meeting in a warehouse that was also used for dances and banquets. In love but poor, the newlyweds rented a small residence on 4th and I Street. And I Street would eventually turn into what we now call Marshall Street. Only a few months prior, Edmund Randolph granted John Marshall the use of his chambers, and yet again, another anecdote of our often misjudged Marshall. So a man was in search of legal services and newly arrived to Richmond. He heard that Marshall's services as a lawyer were highly recommended. However, after seeing Marshall's slovenly manner of dress, he decided to seek another services. So whilst in the courtroom, he saw another case in which he was actually able to witness Marshall's profound skill against the lawyer that he had already obtained. When the recess came, the man approaches Marshall and explains that he had already obtained the services of the other lawyer for $95 and he only had $100 with him, but asked if Marshall would take on his case for that remaining $5. Marshall agrees and adds this wonderful story to his repertoire. In those early days, it could be said that Marshall's closest friend was James Monroe. Having been schooled together as boys, and they shared quarters at Valley Forge. They were both elected to the House of Delegates in the same year, and they were both young lawyers. So after the Richmond's proceedings, the two of them often went to Formicola's Eagle Tavern on Main and 15th Street. They would drink and play cards and billiards, and they would go to see traveling acting troupes perform whilst in town. Marshall was an avid theater goer in a time when theater was considered rather indecent. In 1785, John Marshall receives the deed to both his lot on 9th and I, and also the title to the family home Oak Hill. He stated that it was his plan to spend summers in Oak Hill and winters in Richmond. It is at this time that John's father moves his family permanently to Kentucky. Now, as the family passes through Richmond, John's two youngest siblings are dropped off to live with the young family. Thus, the household grows from John and his pregnant wife Polly and their infant son to include two more children. It seems that they move into an existing dwelling on that Richmond lot to save money until they're able to begin construction of their two-story brick home in 1788. And their house wouldn't be completed until 1790. So it's during this time that John's law and political career are booming. His account books reference an uptick in the purchases of food and wine as he prepares to entertain during the 1787 Virginia Ratifying Convention. Most of the delegates, including Madison, Henry, Pendleton, and Mason, stayed at the Swan Tavern. Now, its location was directly across the street from John Marshall's home. And while Marshall's fine brick home had yet to be completed, he did his fair share of entertaining. Gouverneur Morris and Light Horse Harry Lee amongst those known to have dined at the Marshall household. It has been said that Marshall's greatest contribution to the ratifying convention may well have been a balance to Patrick Henry's affability in Richmond's public houses. The neighborhood that Marshall moved into was known as Court Inn, due to its proximity to the Capitol, completed in 1788. His next-door neighbors were his in-laws, the Amblers, and other neighbors would include Edward Carrington, Daniel Call, William Wirt, John Wickham, Spencer Roane, John Brockenbrough, president of the Virginia Bank, Thomas Nicholas, and Dr. Foushee. In 1798, on 5th and Gray Street, just a few blocks away, George Wythe moved into town. And with a penchant for cold showers, the neighbors often heard him catching his breath and almost shouting with the shock. The 1795 Mutual Assurance plot lists the house, a laundry, a smokehouse, a barn, and a kitchen, and a law office on the lot. So now we're going to talk a little bit about John Marshall's involvement with the Quoits Club, and I'm going to read to you an excerpt from Richmond in Bygone Days by Samuel Mordecai. Blair and Buchanan were important figures in the Buchanan Spring Quoit Club, which began functioning in the last decade of the 18th century and continued well into the 19th. The meeting place was on Buchanan's farm in the shade of great oaks, just beyond the present Hancock Street and near the 1000th block of today's West Broad. On Saturday in spring, summer, and fall, some 30 of Richmond's leading citizens gathered there. The cool springs on the property was notable for its translucent purity, and the shade of the huge trees made it a place of restful quietude. The area then was beyond city limits. Wine, for some reason, was prohibited at the meetings, except on special occasions, but julep, punch, or toddy were regular features, together with porter and ale. The meals were of monumental proportions. They were consumed on a pine table covered by a shed under the masterful ministrations of Jasper Crouch, retained originally by the Richmond Light Infantry Blues, who recognized his ability in roasting pigs, mixing punch, and performing other culinary rites. Crouch presided over the club's gastronomical activities for many years. The Blues, founded in 1789, were given special privileges at the Buchanan farm. All right, so here is yet another little bit of a description of the Quoits Club. This says that lunch, set on a long trestle table under a rough frame structure to shield against the sun, Marshall and Wickham, the caterers, had lunch served at 12:30, each one at the head of the table. And a spit-cooked pig seasoned with mustard, cayenne, and Worcestershire sauce was always served along with punch, which was later a mint julep, but in the early days consisted of brandy, rum, and Madeira, sweetened with sugar and lemon. No water save ice would be added. It's also said, and I'll quote some more from Mordecai's Richmond in Bygone Days, their handsome 32-gallon punch bowl of India china was spectacularly featured on their outings. It also mentions that the Buchanan Spring Quoits Club, their members regularly consumed an astonishing array of meats, fowls, fish, eggs, vegetables, salads, cheeses, and fruits, all washed down with assorted potations. It was natural after such repasts that the sated gentlemen wished to relax, and quoits came next for those who were partial to that sport. John Marshall and Parson Blair were generally the leaders of the two contesting teams, and all other players used highly polished brass rings. But the Chief Justice, with his usual lack of ostentation, had heavy, rough iron rings which he hurled with great dexterity in an effort to ring the peg or come as close to it as possible. And for those not interested in quoits, conversations with politics barred was the order of the day. Such raconteurs and wits as William Wirt and John Wickham and Benjamin Watkins Lee were particular stars here. So with Marshall's political career growing, he was at home in Richmond less often. But when at his new home, he would host his famous lawyers' dinners monthly. These lavish affairs were a coveted invitation to the most prominent male figures in Richmond for that month. Multiple courses and political discussions were a continuation of the conversations that Marshall became famous for during the ratifying convention. Beginning in 1800, Bushrod Washington shipped all of Washington's papers to Marshall's Richmond home. Writing Washington's biography would consume all of Marshall's free time when he was not sitting on the bench. By 1806, Marshall was writing the final of the 5-volume biography of Washington. He and Polly had fallen into the rhythm of spending their summers in Fauquier at Oak Hill and their winters in Richmond. And we're going to talk a little bit about Polly. While vivacious earlier in their relationship, Polly's health began to fail before their brick home was even completed. She had lost 2 children in 1792 and had never quite recovered from the melancholia. By the time John Marshall was tasked by President John Adams to be an envoy on his only trip abroad to represent France to Talleyrand in what would become the XYZ affair, Polly had had several miscarriages and was 3 months pregnant. They quarreled bitterly, but he went to France anyway. During that time, he wrote her often. It seems that she only wrote him 1 time in return during his absence. She did give birth to a healthy John Marshall Jr. in 1796. When he returned, she was bedridden both from physical and mental melancholia. She never quite recovered from her ailments and recused herself from the public from that point on. It seemed that her illness only made John more tender to his wife, and it is said that no one wore shoes in the house when Polly was home, and that the Chief Justice would quiet the neighbors' dogs to protect his frail bride. She would be carried out of the city by John and placed gently into a carriage on parade and festival days. This led to John Marshall being more responsible than the average man to the details of keeping a household, including shopping, which he did daily at the 17th Street Market. In 1835, John Marshall passed away. At that time, the house is deeded to his daughter Mary, who rents it out, and eventually it passes on to John Marshall's granddaughters, Emily and Mary Harvey, and then to the city of Richmond, and finally to Preservation, Virginia. Now, one of the objects that's never really left the house is John Marshall's Supreme Court robe. Conserving John Marshall's robe is one of our top priorities. As such, we have enlisted the services of Howard Sutcliffe. He is the principal conservator at Richmond Region Costume and Textile Conservation. He is a textile conservator based in Montgomery, Alabama, and after training at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, he's worked at several institutions on both sides of the Atlantic, conserving objects as disparate as the Taraz fragments from medieval Egypt and Tsar Nicholas II's parade uniform to Kermit the Frog. Marshall's judicial robe is the most significant surviving artifact documenting his extraordinary judicial career. In 1801, during the first session of the Marshall Court, the newly appointed Chief Justice wore a plain black silk robe in contrast to the scarlet and ermine robes that adorned his fellow justices. By the next year's session, all of the sitting judges followed Marshall's example, wearing plain black robes. This modest act set the stage for the rise of the federal judiciary as the final interpreters of the U.S. Constitution. Only 1 robe survives from Marshall's 34 years of service as a U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice, and they are in need of conservation. After being on constant display for decades, the robe has deteriorated due to the black dye used to color the garment. And without your help, this important national artifact could be lost forever. We hope that you'll donate to Save the Robes Project for the conservation, documentation, and stabilization of the original garment, and a custom-built, climate-controlled archival case. We'll also produce 4 reproduction garments that can be displayed or even worn. And when the robe returns in its case, we'll want to put it in a really great exhibit. So we hope that you will donate to the Save the Robes program, and if you are not yet a member of Preservation Virginia, we hope that you will sign up. After this webinar is completed, I will be around to answer any questions that you may have, and I look forward to talking with you. Thanks. Hi. All right. So I hope you enjoyed that webinar. And there are a couple of I did want to say that after listening to this one more time, for those of you who were keeping track of the dates, I think that John Marshall Jr. was actually born in 1799 and not 96. So, you know, he wasn't born before the XYZ affair actually took place. Um, oh, that's a really great question. So we ended up getting the question, what was the relationship between Patrick Henry and John Marshall? And, you know, for those of you who don't know, Patrick Henry Scotchtown is another one of Preservation Virginia's historic sites. And so it's really been one of the joys of my job to have the opportunity to interpret both Patrick Henry Scotchtown and John Marshall's house. So Patrick Henry is quite a bit older than John Marshall, and so he has a very established career while John Marshall is just kind of entering into the political space. And in his Patrick Henry starts out almost as a hero for Marshall. If you remember during the Battle of Great Bridge, you know, those buckskin uniforms that both he and his father are wearing actually have, you know, Henry's liberty or death stitched onto them. So so while Patrick Henry kind of has some notoriety for being very important in the Revolution, you know, John Marshall is just a young soldier. So as Henry is kind of climbing, or as Marshall is kind of climbing the political ladder, even though they're on different sides, Henry is a notorious anti-federalist, and Marshall ends up being kind of an iconic federalist. Patrick Henry actually endorses John Marshall for office. So there's that. They also are there's a couple of times when they're both lawyers and they both represent the same clients. And I think that there's a couple of primary sources where the people who are up against both Patrick Henry and John Marshall as the legal team pretty much might as well just give up their case. So there's probably a ton more stories, but that just kind of gives you an idea of the relationship between those two figures. So we had a question about if there were any Native American guests to John Marshall's home. Not that we're aware of, but for those of you who might be familiar with the cases that become known as the Marshall Trilogy, there are three cases that John Marshall, as Supreme Court Chief Justice, that come down through his court that basically define federal Indian law. Now, I'm actually not so Preservation Virginia just recently, if you're familiar with us and follow us on social media, then you're probably familiar with the symposium that we just held, which was John Marshall, the Supreme Court, and the Trail of Tears. And so, so for that symposium, we ended up bringing quite a lot of experts. We even actually had the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation speak at the symposium and talk about the long-lasting effects of those trilogy cases. So while there was a precedent set, I can't say that there's any record of there being any guests of the John Marshall house, although recently, as a part of that symposium, we were able to bring several guests, Virginia Indian tribal leaders, as well as several members of the Cherokee Nation to the John Marshall House just earlier this spring. So while not during the time that John Marshall lived there, we can actually say that yes, now there have been, and that was an amazing dinner and tour that I was honored to be a participant in. But if you haven't had a chance to watch, C-SPAN actually recorded that symposium, and it is on our website, and it's also on our Facebook page. So I highly recommend you go back and watch that. It was just really, it was a really epic event. Let's see. So there's a question about Oak Hill, and I'm going to flip to the PowerPoint and show you guys, if I can, the picture of Oak Hill. Here it is. So Oak Hill is still standing. That was what the question was. It's passed through several different hands. As of last decade, it was actually a winery. And so there's been a lot of improvements that have been made to the land. But one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to is that while the blue circle is the portion of the house that was originally constructed for Thomas Marshall, John Marshall's father, when the deed to the land and the house passed on to John Marshall, he constructed this house that's right next to it. Now, for those of you who are familiar with John Marshall's Richmond home and the way that it looks, and then if you notice the portion of the house that John Marshall actually had constructed, if you were to take off that stucco, and there would be brick underneath, and if you take off that porch, the addition to Oak Hill looks strikingly similar. Oops. Strikingly similar to John Marshall's Richmond home. So Oak Hill ends up becoming a dowry or a wedding present to his son when he gets married. So it stays in the Marshall family for a little while. Okay, so there's a question about John Marshall and Mason's Hall in Richmond. And here you have a picture of Randolph Lodge, and that is still there. So if you go to 18th and Franklin in Shockoe Bottom, you'll be able to see the Randolph Lodge still standing there. It's the oldest Masonic lodge that's been in continual use in the country. And it was actually one of our endangered sites in, I believe, 2018. And so one of the things that Preservation Virginia does is every year we have a listing of Virginia's most endangered sites. And from that list, we work with different communities and the stakeholders in order to find the most appropriate way to help preserve these historic places. So in the instance of the Randolph Lodge, we're working, since it's in Richmond, we're working with Historic Richmond Foundation and the Masons, the local Masons, in order to preserve this very important historic site. But Marshall's participation with this, he was actually Grand Master of the Lodge for a time, and he participated quite heavily with the Masons. But it seems that there was actually a point in his career where there was a large anti-Masonic movement. It actually became a political party. And at that time, while Marshall never renounced the Masons, he did seem to step back from publicly supporting and being a Mason. So, you know, I haven't read anything about John Marshall. Okay, so the question was, is there any documented history of John Marshall ever visiting his father in Kentucky? And not that I know of. You know, if one of those Marshall experts that I know are in this webinar want to pipe up and say something different, feel free. But from what I know, I don't believe that he ever did go to Kentucky. Let's see. There's another question about, oh, here's the inside of the Masonic Lodge in case you wanted to see some pictures of that. It's quite an amazing structure. So there was a question about the objects in the house, and so Preservation Virginia has operated the John Marshall House since 1911 as a historic site, and at that point it left the Marshall family and immediately was turned into a historic site. Now, John Marshall was the oldest of 15 children that all survived to adulthood. He and Polly ended up having 6 children that survived to adulthood. And so the descendant community around John Marshall is very strong. And so we have almost 50% of the objects in the house are directly related to John Marshall and his family. So even in this picture, which is a picture of the dining room, the Chinese export porcelain that you see in the buffet is original to the family, as is the set that's on the table. Those silver candelabras, they all belong to John Marshall and his family. And the original dining room table is actually up against the wall there. In this picture, you can see on the left-hand side the desk that belonged to Polly. The glasses and the inkwell that are on it were Marshall pieces. So quite a lot of material. I hope as soon as we're able to reopen, you'll have the opportunity to come and visit. It's really a spectacular site. So there's a question a little bit about the furnishings, and it's interesting that last year we actually had a wonderful exhibit on Richmond furniture. The John Marshall House has, I think, the largest collection of Richmond furniture on display. It was an exhibit that was co-curated by Michael Phillips, who is actually on this on this webinar right now, and we ended up gathering several other pieces from the surrounding area that had oftentimes never been on display that were also Richmond furniture. Let's see. So speaking of this desk that belonged to Polly, this is a piece that was made in Richmond. It seems like that's kind of one of the things that that John Marshall was really he did like to buy local and support local businesses. So this picture that's on the right here, you see this very fine table set and the chairs, and this seems to be something that was purchased probably from New England. But John Marshall's a very large guy. He's over 6 feet, and these dainty little chairs weren't really going to suit him. And so if you look, and I think I can actually use a highlighter, and I'll do that. So if you look at this chair right here that I'm highlighting, so this chair was actually made in Richmond, and it seems like it's mimicking the dainty chairs right here. And we say that because while it's gotten kind of dull after all of these years, this chair is painted to have the same wood finish, and instead of having this brass inlay, it seems like it was a faux gilt in order to kind of mimic that style. So it's a lot more sturdy. It's made out of local wood. It's made in Richmond, and it does seem to very nicely match this other set over here. So we have a ton of examples of that in the house. Michael Phillips tells me that it's tulip poplar is the wood that chair is made out of. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Let's see here. So there's a question about quoits. So I'm going to flip to that slide in just a second. and we can talk a little bit about that. It was a lot of fun to find out the different. I love food history, and to find out what they were eating at this Coits Club was just absolutely fascinating. I mean, a whole spit cooked pig every month. That's pretty impressive. And to find out that it was mustard and Worcestershire. Oh, I should get rid of all of those highlighter pictures. Which is interesting because this photo right here, if you could imagine where VCU, the heart of downtown Richmond is, this was part of Buchanan Springs at the time. And the springs were supposed to be so clear and so pure that there were a couple of different drink manufacturers that popped up. So there was bottled water. At one time, there was a root beer manufacturer that used Buchanan Springs and swore that it was the spring water that made the root beer taste so good. And then a little bit later, there was also a brewery. Of course, there would have been a brewery. Yeah, so the game of quoits, it's very similar to horseshoes. You have, let's see here. You have, this is the, instead of the horseshoe, you have a metal ring that's going to be made out of either brass or, in Marshall's case, in iron. And then you have this right here, which is either known as a peg or a meg. And there's one on the other side. And I kind of a little bit liken it to horseshoes, but also a little bit like croquet. Because when you throw the quoit, the next person who throws the quoit, if they hit yours, then yours gets taken out of play. So kind of like if you hit the croquet ball. But there's stories that once John Marshall was actually in his 70s, he was still drinking mint juleps, which was served out of that 32-gallon punch bowl. But he was also getting down on his hands and knees with a ruler to measure the distance between his quoit to the peg and his opponent's distance. So you know that judiciousness and the fairness and also John Marshall's competitive streak shines through even when he's in his upper 70s. Okay, so you know, I got a question from one of my favorite John Marshall aficionados, who actually wants me to mention some of the craftsmen that were associated with building the house. Now, I'm going to actually pose this question to the folks who actually know that. So if anybody wants to type an answer to that question, the craftsmen that were associated with building, maybe the ones that were associated with carving the wood. But that's kind of been one of the things, one of the who designed the house has always been a mystery. From what we understand, there was some crossover. Jefferson's Capitol was built in 1788, and that's when the work starts on the Marshall House, and so that house was completed in 1790. And so there's a lot of evidence that says that the people who worked on the Capitol were also hired by John Marshall to construct his house. But if anybody there, okay, let's see. So Ed Foss and William Hodgson are some of the folks. Yes, so William Hodgson is a carver and a furniture maker who was also apparently very well known for doing decorations on hearths and on trim work, that sort of thing. So he's pretty famous. He did the work on the interior state capitol. Is he the one who's also buried at St. John's? Yes. All right. So he's also buried at St. John's Church. So you can visit him if you're in downtown Richmond. Somebody asked how tall John Marshall was. I believe he was about 6'1", which is a full foot taller. They say that Polly was about 5'1". somebody asked about the different taverns, and so I'm going to go to the slide that that shows where a lot of those are. You know, one of the very fascinating things about Richmond is that when John Marshall moves here, there's less than 2,000 people in the city, but there sure are a lot of taverns. Oops. Let's see. Sorry guys about the slides. Going back and forth real quick. Here we are. And they're also known as public houses. So the one that was really popular that John Marshall and Monroe often visited was Eagle Tavern, or also known as Formicola's. So this was pretty close to downtown Shockoe Bottom area, and you can see a lot of the. Let's see, I'll get the highlighter out. So you can see several of the other taverns in the area. All of a sudden, the middle, I can't quite see what I'm doing, so hold on a second. But yeah, so several of these taverns are scattered across the city that were able to be on view. And let's see, I'll go back to Swan Tavern real quick so you can see that one. Here it is. So Swan Tavern ended up lasting into the very early part of the 20th century before it was torn down. And Swan Tavern is a little bit, at the time that things like the ratifying convention were taking place, this was considered to be the premier public house for people to visit, to stay at. It's a block away from the Capitol. So if you could imagine all of the visitors coming from out of state, sorry, I've got somebody in the kitchen cooking. If you could imagine all of the visitors coming to the Capitol and to take place, and whether it's a court case or in other times just to be witnesses to court cases, or if it's for whatever other political meetings, the folks are actually, a lot of them are staying in these taverns. So this would have been where Patrick Henry would have been kind of holding court, trying to convince folks not to ratify the Constitution. And it would have been just one block away that John Marshall would have been in his on his property, trying to convince people of the opposite. Let's see, so we have just a few minutes left. So I have to say, so you know that this webinar, there were 2 times, and there was a time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then there was a time, this time right now. But there's so many of my very favorite people that are on this one who are just absolute experts, and so they're giving me this great information. Part of it says that part of the lore of the Randolph Masonic Lodge is that many of the craftsmen that from the Masonic Lodge moved to the Capitol and then to Marshall's house. So there is that connection between the Masons and the Capitol and John Marshall's house. And then we have another comment that says that there is about 15 new licenses to operate taverns in Richmond right after Richmond became the new capital of Virginia. So that's really interesting. Thanks, guys. So I think we're pretty much running to the end of this webinar. If there's anything else that you guys are dying to know, just go ahead and ask now. But while we're wrapping up, I'll just go ahead and say that this is the first, well, it's the second for me, but it's the same topic in one day. But this is the first webinar that Preservation Virginia has put out, and we've had a remarkable response. But this is my first webinar, so we're looking for feedback. There's going to be a survey that's going to go out to everybody who signed up. I really would love it if you guys would go ahead and fill that out. Be honest, you won't hurt my feelings. If there's things that you like, things that you didn't, other topics that you would like to see, not just for me. We have a brilliant staff, and they are currently working on their own series of webinars. But if there's any topic that you think would really be interesting and you'd want to know more about, just let us know. And if I didn't get to your question, I have all of your email addresses, so I'll be able to email you a response. And once again, if you are not yet a member of Preservation Virginia, just go to the website, preservationvirginia.org, and you'll be able to sign up, support the great work that we're doing around the state for historic preservation, and also support the historic sites that we own and operate. And this was a great way to spend the evening. Thank you for letting me talk to you about John Marshall and Preservation Virginia. So everybody, you have a great night, and talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.